We are witnessing the biggest experiment in government activism since certainly the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, possibly, arguably since the New Deal.
Have a great day and welcome to my channel. In today's video, we take a closer look at Biden's Made in America tax plan and how the president plans to counterfund his massive stimulus packages. But let's start from the scratch. Joe Biden announced the largest infrastructure stimulus package in history of America, worth over $2 trillion. Accordingly, Biden is focusing on the following sectors: investing up to $620 billion in transportation, $400 billion in care for disabled and elderly, and over $130 billion in education. Biden justifies his infrastructure package by citing decades without investment in bridges, roads, and water systems, resulting in a 13th place global infrastructure ranking. In his plan, the president wants to repair highways, rebuild bridges, and modernize ports, airports, and transit systems. In the process, 20,000 miles of highways and roads are to be modernized. According to the White House, 1 in 5 miles of U.S. highways and major roads are in poor condition, totaling 173,000 miles. This is equivalent to around 60 times the distance from San Francisco to New York. Delays caused by traffic congestion alone cost over $160 billion per year. In addition to replacing road systems, Biden also believes modernizing public transportation is critical. According to the Department of Transportation, current infrastructure is inadequate and repair backlogs are estimated to exceed $105 billion. Moreover, Biden wants to rehabilitate more than 2 million homes and commercial buildings, modernize schools and child care facilities, and upgrade veterans' hospitals and federal buildings. Companies also hope to benefit from these investments in infrastructure. Cisco Systems CEO Chuck Robbins provides an insight into what this might look like.
Yeah, infrastructure these days is pretty much technology across the board. Even industrial infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc., have an element of technology because they're generally going to be considered smart infrastructure. We also have obviously the broadband build out. We've got the need for 5G connectivity. So we think that an infrastructure bill would certainly benefit us over the long term. Well, it's tough to say, Brian. It depends on what all is included in there. Clearly, there will be a lot of sort of traditional roads and infrastructure, which the country needs desperately, and would also create jobs and opportunity for people. But then the broadband build out would certainly lead customers of Cisco to need to build out more infrastructure, probably accelerate 5G deployments, which would be good for us. And we've seen a significant uptick lately in our business serving the web scale providers, as well as we see the early stages of the 5G build out in the consumer space today. And we think that as these customers begin to migrate their 5G offerings to more enterprise services, that's when we'll actually see backbone upgrades, et cetera. So we think that, we'll have to see how the bill is written, but certainly the digital aspects of it will be helpful for us.
Nevertheless, not everyone is completely satisfied with the announced economic stimulus package. Here is the reaction from Stephen Ratner, Willett Advisors Chairman and CEO, about Joe Biden's infrastructure package.
This is a bit of the same thing. We call it an infrastructure bill. It's a simple thing to call it, but only by, depending on how you count, 35–40% at the most of what's in this bill is for infrastructure. The rest is for all kinds of other things, including, and I'm not being critical of the need, but I'm a little critical of calling it infrastructure, $400 billion. So almost 20% of this bill is to raise the pay of home health care workers. And again, that may be and is a pressing need, but it's not infrastructure. There are 76 at least initiatives in this bill. I counted them. Many of them completely unspecified as to how they would work. And in my opinion, they rely too heavily, again, similar to the carbon tax, on government mandates, government directives, government investing in startup kinds of energy projects, clean energy projects. That is very scary to me. And I think there are ways, like the carbon tax, to use the private sector to implement a lot of these very admirable goals in a much more tax and cost efficient way for the American public, American taxpayer.
Ratner notes that the private sector falls short and quite a few activities are taken over by the public sector. This has not always been associated with success. Ratner uses the example of carbon tax to illustrate how a successful introduction of government measures can work.
It is the simplest, most effective way for us to deal with the environmental problem. You use market incentives, taxes, to drive behavior as opposed to pages and pages, thousands and thousands of pages of government regulations trying to force people to do things. Taxes get that to happen. If you put a $43 a ton tax on carbon, it would roughly raise gasoline prices by 38 cents. That would significantly diminish driving. I know that there'd be an adverse impact on people of lesser means. And so I would propose taking that tax revenue and rebating it through the tax system to people below the top income level so that they are not hurt by it, but it does change behavior and drive people bit by bit, no pun intended, away from driving and toward other modes of transportation and so forth, all through the energy system.
When considering the size of this stimulus package, it is important to remember that it must be used in a targeted and efficient manner and must not be allowed to fizzle out. The next president would probably have to deal with the consequences of poor implementation.
Yeah, look, I think it is critically important that if this bill is passed, that it be implemented well. 76 initiatives, at least, maybe more, does scare me when you think about a typical bill might have 2 or 3, and now we're kind of on steroids. But if government fails to implement this well, and if when the dust settles, the American public looks back on it and says, this was a failure, that is going to make it very tough for the next president to lean in and do things like this. And it's got to work for this to have credibility, or else the next guy who comes along is going to do what Ronald Reagan famously did in 1980 and say government is not the solution, government is the problem, and people will believe him because in 1980 government wasn't functioning. So it's going to be incumbent on the Biden administration not just to get this plan passed, but to implement it well in a way that people will look at it and say, this was great, this really made the country better. And in that context, I do worry that there's not much use of the private sector, either human capital or human resources in the government, or partnering and using tax incentives and using the private sector to make this work and be implemented as effectively as possible.
In the fact sheet, The American Jobs Plan, President Biden also fleshes out how he plans to fund this massive expenditure. This plan essentially consists of the following: increase the tax on corporations and make international corporations more taxable by increasing global minimum tax rates for U.S. multinational corporations to 21%. While Trump had just recently reduced corporate tax rates from 35% to 21%, Biden wants to reverse most of this effect in terms of size. Biden's plan includes a tax increase to 28% from 21%. The reason behind this increase can be seen in the numbers. A study conducted found that 91 Fortune 500 companies paid $0 in federal corporate income tax on U.S. earnings in 2018. In addition, the average tax rate that companies paid on their income in 2018 decreased from 16% to 8%. Let's listen to what problem Stephen Ratner sees with raising corporate taxes.
The problem on the corporate side is pretty simple, in my mind anyway, which is that we, for better or for worse, live in a global world. And so we don't control our own destiny entirely when it comes to corporate taxes, because what we've learned is that companies can shift both legitimately and somewhat illegitimately their profits to other jurisdictions which have lower tax rates. And so it has been on a global basis a race to the bottom in corporate tax rates. Ireland famously, I think, is at 12.5%. Even Britain was below 20%, although I think they're now raising it a bit. Canada has a very low corporate tax rate, and so forth.
The increase in corporate income tax that will accompany the announced economic stimulus package will inevitably lead to a rethink in corporate decision-making processes. Higher tax rates reduce the profitability of companies, and this consequently affects their investment and hiring plans. Let's listen to the thoughts of Chuck Robbins on this.
Well, I mean, clearly a higher tax rate just ends up with us having, lower profitability, and so it certainly impacts all of our spending. And so I think, you have to balance that. You have to balance it with R&D investment. You have to balance it with job creation. And we have to balance it with being competitive on a global basis, because other companies that we compete with globally don't face that kind of a tax rate. So we're hopeful that they'll find a common ground or some sort of compromise on that. And I understand the issues that the government is facing. I understand the challenges that they're trying to deal with from a budgetary perspective. But, capitalism and the businesses in this country are what create these jobs and create, the wealth and the opportunity. We have to do a better job of ensuring that the opportunity is available to everyone in this country. That's the biggest thing we need to focus on. And but we need to make sure our companies remain competitive on a global basis as well.
In my opinion, the proposed introduction of a global minimum tax rate would be much more comprehensive than raising the corporate income tax rate. This idea was recently brought up by the current U.S. Treasury Secretary and former head of the Fed, Janet Yellen. It is an approach that has been extensively discussed, to introduce a uniform minimum tax rate for companies around the world. This is to prevent companies from picking the country with the lowest tax bill, which can prevent tax competition between countries. Yellen described this process as a 30-year race to the bottom that has allowed big corporations to avoid contributing to the tax system. The plan is simply to charge a minimum tax rate, so that companies pay a minimum amount of tax no matter where they are based. This would reduce the urge for companies to leave countries with higher tax rates. Low-tax countries like Ireland have a strong competitive advantage due to their policies, which has encouraged companies like Apple to locate there.
And so I think the most important thing that's going on at the moment that we shouldn't lose sight of is Janet Yellen's initiative to create a global minimum tax rate. I don't know if she'll succeed or not. It's in the interest of all the OECD members who she's talking to agree to something like that. But that is a big part of the yin and the yang over corporate taxes. If we had a global agreement, we could raise our corporate taxes without worrying about jobs and companies and profits leaving the U.S. Without one, this is part of why corporate taxes were lowered, which was to keep us competitive with the rest of the world. But all in all, corporate taxes should go up. They are a smaller and smaller percentage of our federal budget. Companies are contributing less and less in tax revenue relative to what individuals are paying, and that needs and should be reversed.
Let's take a closer look at who is actually responsible for what tax revenue. Federal tax revenue in 2019 was approximately $3.5 trillion, or about 16.3% of GDP. The ratio has fluctuated between 14.6% and 20% of GDP over the past 50 years. Corporate tax revenues at the federal, state and local levels in the U.S. counts for 1% of GDP, compared with about 2% in Germany, France and Italy, and around 4% in Japan and Canada. Individuals, on the other hand, contributed 8.1% of GDP, almost 8 times as much to tax revenue as corporations. The individual income tax has been the largest single source of federal revenue since 1950. Looking at the total tax revenues of around $3.5 trillion in 2019, 50% was raised by individual income tax, whereas only 7% by corporate income tax. Look at that big difference. Individuals are responsible for 50% of tax revenues, while corporation just for 7%. This figure is meant to graphically illustrate the difference once again. Look at the huge, light blue colored portion of the individuals and how much they are contributing to the system. in contrast to corporate taxes, which have been declining over the last 50 years. The share of individuals in total tax revenue has been rising steadily. This should clarify why Janet Yellen points out that it is important that all citizens share the burden of government finance fairly. As we can see, there are different opinions on the topic of tax increases. The fact that spending through the stimulus package is to be counter-financed by taxes is understandable in principle. Nevertheless, it should not be forgotten that tax increases also mean fewer jobs are created and companies can invest less. There is no question that tax revenues should be distributed more evenly in the future. It is also individuals who can boost the economy by increasing consumption through higher net wages. It remains exciting to see whether Biden's plans will be accepted by Congress and whether and in what form they will be implemented in the near future.